Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Happy Saturday, everybody. I hope you're enjoying a restful weekend. First up, let's talk about China's technology champion Huawei, which, despite loud triumphalist noises in recent months, may be feeling the pinch of US sanctions. US-based outlet The Information reports that Huawei will miss its target of having 2.5 million chips ready before releasing the Mate 70 phones later this month. Based on current production capacity and productivity, the company will not meet that target, which is necessary to meet expected consumer demand for the phone, unnamed people told the outlet. Quote, Huawei could still announce the phone next week, but make only a small number of phones immediately available for purchase, forcing customers to pre-order and wait for delivery. End quote. The new smartphone chip is made at the most advanced chip-making process available in China, the N+3, which Huawei and SMIC hope is comparable to the 5-nanometer process of leading chip manufacturer Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Co. TSMC's 5-nanometer process is a couple of years out of date, being used to make the chips for the iPhone 12, 13 and 14. The report, if true, would suggest Huawei is facing serious issues. The Mate 70 chips SMIC did manage to produce also, quote, had a high rate of defects, end quote. As many as 60% of the chips on each wafer were deemed unusable, said the two people with direct knowledge of the situation speaking to the outlet. Meanwhile, on Thursday, Alan Estevez, who runs the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security in the US, announced that Washington will target China with new quantum chip-related export curbs, expressing, quote, allying our controls on quantum and other advanced technologies makes it significantly more difficult for our adversaries to develop and deploy these technologies in ways that threaten our collective security, end quote. Besides quantum computing items, the controls will affect equipment for purchasing advanced semiconductors, additive manufacturing items to produce metal components, and gate all-round field effect transistor technology, according to the Federal Registrar posting. Washington trade lawyer Kevin Wolf, speaking to UK-based The Financial Times, explains, quote, the most significant controls are the ones on quantum computers and related technology. They have novel reporting requirements for new foreign national employees working on quantum computer development in the United States. End quote. Speaking of the wider technology war between China and the US-led West, this week the CEO of Dutch tech giant ASML, speaking at a city conference in New York, said he expects pushback against US-led restrictions to grow. At the same time, he argued Chinese advances in chip making are slowing due to restrictions that are already in place, expressing, quote, I think to make the case that this is about national security is getting harder and harder. Most probably there will be more pressure for restrictions. But I also think there will be much more pushback, and I think we have to hope we reach a certain equilibrium, because as a business, what we all want is a bit of clarity, a bit of stability. End quote. We note that his company faces billions in lost sales if more restrictions are put on his company, so there is a very potential conflict of interest. Next up for the economy, in a rare and telling move, at a panel discussion at the Bund Summit in Shanghai on yesterday, former People's Bank of China Governor Yi Gang said Beijing should focus on ending deflation, expressing, quote, I think right now they should focus on fighting deflationary pressure. Overall, we have the problem of weak domestic demand, especially on the consumption and investment side. So that needs proactive fiscal policy and accommodative monetary policy. End quote. The former central bank governor explained that China's immediate focus should be to turn its gross domestic product deflator positive in the coming quarter. He pointed out that the broad measure of prices has been negative for 7 quarters. Yi's comments marked one of the most explicit acknowledgements by a former People's Bank of China official of concerns over China's deflation, which could weigh on the economy as falling prices lead consumers to delay purchases and businesses to slash wages. Producer prices fell for 22 straight months in July, underscoring persistent deflationary pressures. US-based Bloomberg writes that analysts in China have been advised to avoid discussing sensitive terms such as deflation or expressing views deemed overly negative for the economy. That comes as the country's GDP deflator marked its longest slide since 1999. Quote, Yi's remarks contrast with his tenure that were marked by restrained policy, underlying the urgency to address deflation. The former People's Bank of China chief appeared to downplay risks of deflation just a month before he stepped down last month, saying there's a time lag between the post-pandemic rebound in demand and supply. End quote. Next to Yi on the panel was Haruhiko Kuroda, former governor of the Bank of Japan, who said Japan's experience dealing with 15 years of deflation indicates that central banks should avoid prolonged deflation even if it's mild. A comparison I'm sure would give Beijing and its policymakers a degree of disquietude. Next up, this week, Beijing ended the international adoption program launched during the one-child policy era. On Thursday, a PRC Foreign Ministry spokesperson told reporters that under China's new policy, international adoptions would be limited to foreigners adopting children or stepchildren of relatives. According to State Department statistics, the leading destination historically for adoptions was the US, which adopted more than 82,000 Chinese children between 1999 and 2023. Most of this was in the first few years, with the number dwindling into the double digits in the last few years of that period. The large majority of these were girls. It is unclear whether this was out of concern for girls born during the one-child era or a general sex bias in the West for girls over boys. Kay Johnson, a professor of Asian Studies at Hampshire College, in a 2016 book, China's Hidden Children, argued that in the 1990s many parents of adoptees had relinquished their children to escape punishment by family planning officials. International adoption from China has seen scandals in recent history too. In 2006, state media documented the trial of a trafficking ring that had been selling babies to 6 orphanages in Hunan province. Foreigners had made donations of up to $3,000 to adopt a child from the orphanages. US-based The Wall Street Journal reports that the international adoptions from China had been declining for years and were largely on hold since the pandemic. Many countries have tightened restrictions on international adoptions, driven in part by concerns over the adoption of children who have been stolen from their parents. China's move also reflects how concerns have shifted in recent decades from overpopulation to sharply slowing birth rates. Next up, we have one more development to cover, but just quickly, if you're enjoying or getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button, liking, sharing with people who you think would appreciate this sort of content, and subscribing if you want to be on top of the most up-to-date analysis on China as it's released every day are all tremendous helps for the channel. This channel can only grow if you, the audience, keep the algorithm happy. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. This week has seen the 2024 summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, with Beijing hosting dozens of African leaders. We covered this earlier in the week. Looking forward to the event. We have seen several developments since, which we will cover here. General Secretary Xi Jinping is using the 3-day summit with African leaders to solidify political and economic ties with the continent, despite tensions over debt, several years of declining financing, and broader concerns over China's economy. With his opening speech, the General Secretary leaned heavily into the themes we have seen in recent years in China's ideological and narrative battle with the West over the so-called Global South specifically, and the international community generally. Xi Jinping expressed in his speech, quote, "Modernization is an inalienable right of all countries, but the Western approach to it has inflicted immense suffering on developing countries. China and Africa's joint pursuit of modernization will set off a wave of modernization in the Global South and open a new chapter in our drive for a community with a shared future for mankind." End quote. In the speech, Xi announced 10 so-called partnership actions in mutual learning among civilizations, trade prosperity, industrial chain cooperation, connectivity, development cooperation, health, agriculture and livelihoods, people-to-people and cultural exchanges, green development and common security. He said the 10 actions would be funded by 360 billion yuan, $50 billion of financial support through the next 3 years. In a departure from a relatively low-key approach to security and political ties, Xi also announced $140 million in military aid and said that Chinese instructors would train 6,000 military personnel and 1,000 police officers in Africa. Xi also promised to create 1 million jobs on the continent and said that the financing would be split between 30 infrastructure projects to boost connectivity and 1,000 smaller projects focused on improving livelihoods. Some analysts observed, however, that China has made promises to the continent in the past, promises that were not met. During the previous summit in 2021, Beijing said it would buy $300 billion of African goods, and China fell far short of this target. China is also unlikely going to be able to respond to African concerns over trade deficits, as China itself, as regular viewers know, is facing chronically weak consumption. Song Wei, a professor at the School of International Relations and Diplomacy at Beijing Foreign Studies University, told the state-run Global Times on Thursday, quote, "Our offering of zero-tariff treatment to the least developed countries in Africa is actually a crucial component of support for trade. The core development concept is to unlock Africa's autonomous development capabilities, to enhance trade, rather than merely increasing the volume and quality of China-Africa trade." End quote. On this issue of trade, though, as we noted earlier this week, while China often boasts that it is a great market for the global south, actually the EU trade with Africa surpasses that of the next three largest partners combined, including China in second place. Furthermore, Africa enjoys a trade surplus with the EU while facing a $45 billion deficit with China. Some fear that efforts to unload some of China's excess capacity could undermine African nations' bid to move up the value chain too, from exporting raw materials to making finished goods. Some African leaders have pushed back against concerns of predatory lending as well. South Africa's president, for example, speaking to reporters about China's pledge at the summit of $51 billion in new funding for Africa, expressed, quote, "I don't necessarily buy the notion that when China invests, it is with an intention of, in the end, ensuring that those countries end up in a debt trap or in a debt crisis." End quote. At the same time, high global interest rates and a longer-term decline in Western development aid have left many African countries with few alternatives to more Chinese funding. Despite these concerns in the relations between China and these African countries, though, China is giving the West a run for its money in winning hearts and minds in Africa. According to a survey published this week, conducted for the South African-based Ichikowitz Family Foundation, 82% of young Africans consider Beijing's influence on the continent as positive, up from 79% in 2020. 80% feel the same for the UK, down from 87%, and 79% for Washington, also down from 87%. The survey interviewed 5,604 people between 18 and 24 years of age across 16 African nations in July and February of this year. The survey report explained that Chinese products and infrastructure investment were the primary drivers for positive views for China. Where US positive views were from was, quote, "the provision of loans and economic support," end quote. Furthermore, a US-based Pew survey in 2024 found that the majority of respondents in Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa thought China and its companies had a positive impact on their economy. However, there are large minorities from each of these countries that are not as thrilled. China is already the second most popular higher education destination for Africans after France and ahead of the US. Hannah Ryder, chief executive of Development Reimagined, an Africa-focused consulting firm, explained this week that the African continent represents 54 votes at the United Nations, and China recognizes that having the backing of so many countries looks good on the international stage. She argues that Africa's need for development is so big that it shouldn't have to pick between joining with China and the US. Quote, "African leaders don't want to choose between two superpowers. They want to develop." End quote. While this is true, and there are areas where China and the US and others can all help Africa across the board, in some spaces, especially in global geopolitics, the reality is it's a zero-sum game. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful weekend. There may be an extra episode tomorrow, so I will either see you tomorrow, Sunday, or on Monday.